It's UofL Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Phil. As you folks know that have listened to the show from time to time, this is the show that's about all things University of Louisville. We talk about research, we talk about students, and things going on campus. So that's what you're going to get today if you stick around for the next half hour or so. All right, what have we got on the show today? Well, two-time presidential candidate Steve Forbes was on campus just a couple of weeks ago talking with the folks from the Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise, and I also got an interview with him. So we're going to talk to Steve Forbes, the former presidential candidate, about the economy, taxes, and Donald Trump. So you'll want to stick around for that interview. But first, if you were a student at U of L, you know all about the Red Barn. It's the on-campus gathering and party place for students since about 1969 or so. And in fact, Louis and Louise Bornwasser were students at that time and helped get the Red Barn off the ground, and they're still involved in the Red Barn. They're here with George Howe, who has overseen the operation and events at the Red Barn for many years. They've got some stories to tell and a little bit of background on the Red Barn. And George, I didn't make you sound that old, did I?
No, that's fine.
All right, it's good to see you. And Bornwasser's good to meet you,
Yeah,
too.
and don't feel bad, George, because I'm the only one you know that was there before you.
Well, that puts some years on you then, Louis. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the Red Barn. Folks who went to U of L obviously know about the Red Barn, but folks who didn't go to U of L may not have any idea what the Red Barn is. So just kind of a brief description of what is the Red Barn.
Well, you have to look at what U of L was the largest university we know of that did not have any form of student center. And so when urban renewal came through and cleaned things out, there were opportunities. But, we're not smart enough to think of that. The fraternity fellows threw a party on this off-campus site. I was asked to hook up a generator to the lighting system, and it was a great time. It was like a Smothers Brothers type thing with beer and comedy and Dixieland.
So this was in what year?
69.
Okay.
And at the end of it, I thought, we should keep this forever. And so 3 or 4 of us who, I might add, had not much beer to drink,
Yeah, right.
stayed there all night and figured out how much we could get something barely functional for. And that later that day, which was a Sunday, I called Dr. Strickler, the president, at home. And I said, I can get you a student center. It's going to be ugly, but it's going to cost you $12,000.
So that's how the Red Barn started in
That's
1969. But the Red Barn, it was already a building there. So, George, just kind of describe it. Describe the Red Barn to somebody who's never seen it before, never been there. Kind of describe it.
Yeah, it was about 5,000 square feet. It was part of the Caldwell Tank complex that moved out on Preston Highway, which was relocated. It was founded in 1887, so that building was built about that time.
In the 1880s. So the building, This brick building dates back to the 1880s.
Exactly. It was probably 5% of their complex, and it was what was left. There was another building that was left as well, which was torn down.
Okay.
But there was a lot of hope for the Red Barn, and it's 5,000 square feet. Now it's about 7,000 square feet because we made an addition in '78. But
all right, so
that's
it's still standing and still serving students. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Now, Louise, you were in school in '69, right?
Yes.
In the Red Barn. So, I mean, when did you and Louis know each other at the
We
time?
knew each other. We
Okay.
had dated briefly when I was a freshman.
Okay.
And I happened to be
And then you ditched him, or what?
a little bit of both, maybe. A little bit of both. And when I was a junior, junior, I went to that concert. Mm-hmm. And it was the best concert. I don't think we've had one since. It was just Dixieland and banjos, and everybody just had a really great time. And that was really the beginning of everything.
That's when you said, we've got to have a place for students to have things like this.
Well,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's where the Red Barn was born.
Yes.
Right? Okay. We're talking with Louise Bornwasser, who, by the way, congratulations, you're going to be getting an award, an alumni award for your work with the Red Barn, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
All right, and George Howe, who's the director of the Red Barn and oversees operations over there. And we're talking about the Red Barn, which is on U of L's campus. What are some of the things and some of the memories that you all have of the Red Barn? Louis, you've already talked about that first night, but what are some of the other things that have gone on at the Red Barn that are kind of interesting stories that people might be interested in, or funny stories? I don't know.
probably the biggest thing that ever happened was in 1980, on May 2nd. In 1979, our chairman, Paul Noltemeyer, wrote a letter to Roone Arledge telling him that he could use the Red Barn for a concert. So we kind of joked about it the entire year, and we got a call from our vice president 3 weeks before the Derby who said, I want you to come over to my office. And I said, ABC's coming to the Red Barn, aren't they? And they did on May 2nd with Dan Fogelberg. Which
So
was
there was a Dan
live.
Fogelberg concert at the Red
Yeah,
Barn?
right.
Yeah.
At the Red Barn?
A 90-minute show.
Really?
And,
Okay.
And
it
he
was,
debuted Run for the Roses.
Oh, that
that's
song
where he
that they always play at
debuted.
Derby
That's
time. Yeah.
it.
Yes.
It
And
was
this
a-
was hooked into Derby weekend.
Right,
yeah,
okay.
it was. They were Churchill Downs could not provide them a venue, so they somehow found the letter to Roone Harlich, or they just found the Red Barn. But
Okay.
it was the biggest thing that ever had happened, other than the first concert at the Red Barn. So. A funny story about it was Dale Ramsey, who's now the director of the Student Recreation Center down the street. He was interviewing that day with Mr. Mendelson for a graduate assistant job. So he asked Mr. Mendelson, he said, where am I going tonight? So he pulled out this invitation that Harold Adams had signed. It was a private party at the Red Barn. And he said, oh my goodness. So he said, I must come to U of L. And he did. He's never left. So he came in 1980.
So that got Dale Ramsey to U of L, right?
That's how he got here, yeah.
All right. Louise, so you two didn't meet at the Red Barn, so we don't have some
No.
mythical story about how you two fell in love at the Red Barn or anything like
No.
that?
Met at
No.
U of L, though.
We
Not
met
at U of L.
years before, a few years before.
Okay.
But there have been marriages and
Yeah.
people who have met at the Red Barn through the years.
Okay. And then, so you were a junior in '69, right?
Yes.
Louis, what were you? What year were you?
Senior.
You were a senior. So you didn't stick around then.
I built it and ran.
Or you got it going and ran. So in the next 10 to 15 years, did you guys still have contact with the U of L campus and pay
Absolutely.
attention to what was going on at the Red Barn?
Absolutely. There used to be concerts, and it was very loud. And we would drive past the Red Barn, and if the street was shaking, we'd go right past because it was too loud.
Well, you got earplugs for those
You know,
things. you know?
open the door and reach out and touch the center stripe. It's moving too much.
Too much. It's too darn loud. You were even young at that time. So, and the other thing about the Red Barn that's kind of interesting to me is you got this old building, and again, this was before the Swain Student Center was built. The Student Activity Center was
Yes.
built. So people don't realize there really wasn't any place
No.
for students just to go hang out and get some food and have a beer, that kind of thing, right?
That's
well,
right.
the Red Barn was kind of a student-led organization in a way to shame the university to build a student center.
Well,
The
it worked
idea was
eventually.
to tear it down and use it as a weapon to get a student center. Well, now we've got both, so I guess that's even better.
George, you want to talk about and mention a couple of guys that played a key role in the renovation of the Red Barn.
They did. One was named David Lee, and one was named Harry Sparks. Dave Lee, Dr. Miller hired him. He was the architect who built the Health Science Center, and shortly thereafter he was hired. And their offices were in what is now the Cultural Center, which is very close to the Red Barn, and the Red Barn was the edge of the campus back in the day. So they fell in love with the Red Barn just as we had, and they convinced Dr. Miller to save the Red Barn and renovate it, because with urban renewal you had to tear it down or fix it up. So that was our alternative, and so we had a campaign to save the Red Barn, and Dr. Miller went along with that and said, if you find the money, which they did, we renovated the Red Barn. So that became very, very, very important, and it was opened back up, and we were only closed about 6-7 months, so we were a semester without the Red Barn, and we opened back up in January of '79.
Well, and Louise, wasn't there some sort of preservation award that you or someone else got for preserving the Red Barn?
Yes, the Preservation Alliance of Louisville gave Red Barn an award on May 15th, 1979. And it's the idea that it was renovated with the idea of being very sympathetic to the original design of the Red Barn.
So it was a preservation award.
Yes.
Bottom line was what happened there. What goes on at the Red Barn these days? George, what do you have in there?
We have a ton of stuff. We have 26 WFPK live lunch concerts, which we do live with WFPK, of course, when they don't do them down at the station. We have all kind of student events, LGBT, Student Activities Board, Engage, Lead, Serve, which is a community service. Housing, Raise Red, which raises money for U of L health issues. MPHC, Pan Atlantic, IFC, sorority.
So you got a lot of events for students and
every
stuff
day.
still going on there.
Blood drive today.
And you know one thing I've got to ask here,
Yeah.
because this is a thing with me. Beer is served at the Red Barn, right?
Occasionally.
Occasionally.
Not quite as much as it was.
But you have
back
to have
in
a
the day.
license to do it. And so,
Well, now we use Airmark.
but didn't it used to be that that was kind of the on-campus bar that students could go get a beer at?
We had a with Virginia Davis, who just passed away, but she was with State ABC, and she, for about 35 years, we had a beer license went for 6 months, and we would just turn it over and turn it over and turn it over. So
Right. And
it worked fine.
This is just personal opinion. I went to school at Western Kentucky, and we didn't have an on-campus bar. Not very many universities do anymore for insurance purposes. But I always thought it was a great idea because if you go to the on-campus place and you have a few too many, you can walk back to the door.
And
You don't have to get in a car.
What makes it especially funny is I was all for having the beer, although I don't drink it myself, because my thought was better to have them stumbling home drunk from a nearby location, not killing themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the Red Barn Association has meant in terms of philanthropy and help for students. Go ahead, I don't know, one of you guys pick it up and tell us what we're talking about
Well,
here.
the Red Barn Alumni Association was begun in 1985 with some recent graduates who wanted to continue supporting the Red Barn. And the Red Barn has raised almost $500,000 in scholarships for students, which is kind of where we came in. There was a meeting, and George mentioned that some students were having emergencies, and that's where we came in with our emergency fund. But the Red Barn Alumni Association, I think the big thing that most people on campus know about is the crawfish boil. Mm-hmm. Because in one of the last events for the school year is a crawfish boil that the Red Barn Alumni Association helps sponsor, and it's the best bargain there is, $5 all you can eat crawfish. And
And that money goes where?
To it goes to students. 100% of it goes to students through programs and scholarships through the Red Barn Alumni Association.
Okay.
so the Red Barn has always been by and for students.
Right. So this Lewis, this emergency fund,
Yes.
you all helped set up, I think, with a $75,000
Yeah.
initial grant. When we're talking about students that have needs or emergency needs, what is that? What does that
There-
mean?
If you look at it, it's like any kind of a grant. If you don't exactly qualify for this one and you don't qualify for that one, you kind of fall through the cracks. George had a good system going that had been used up to then where they would call everybody in the whole university and everybody would kick in a few dollars and they would come up with enough money to solve the problem. And I thought, that's what we need, is we need a grant system that fills in the cracks. And that's what we are. If nothing else pays and you've got no place to go, you come here and throw yourself on the mercy. And if they can see their way to do it, then they do.
So it's like a pool of money for students.
Yeah.
Like, give me a for instance, George. Have you got a student that you can think of that maybe don't use their name, but they were, I don't know, they needed $2,000 to get from their sophomore to junior year, otherwise they were going to have to drop out, and you gave them $2,000
There you
to
go.
get them through, something like that?
Yeah,
Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that fund is administered by the Dean of Students office. And they've given out 45 awards totaling almost $14,000. So it will be there forever.
Okay.
So it's most helpful. We don't touch the lives of those people who get it but we know who those people are and we track it, so we know how much is given away.
There was a student whose dorm was flooded, and then there was another student in the Henryville tornado who needed transportation in his last semester to get to school. And so it was just an emergency award. And the idea is that later, when they become adults, that they can then pay it forward.
George Howe, Louise, and Louise Bornwasser, congratulations on getting the Alumni Award. Thanks for your help with the Red Barn. Appreciate you being on the show. We're here with Steve Forbes, who you probably recognize as a former presidential candidate, twice presidential candidate, and he has always been the chairman and CEO of Forbes Media Incorporated. He's at the University of Louisville as a guest of the Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise, and he's here to talk to some students and folks who are going to come hear you speak tonight. Steve, thanks for being on our campus. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Mark. Thank you.
So let's just start from the top and ask the question just to get it out of the way. What do you think of Donald Trump?
I think still, since we're here in the university, the grade is incomplete. The key thing on his presidency, I think, is going to hinge on the tax bill. If he gets a big tax cut through, which will help the economy, he'll be in good shape. Republicans will be in good shape in 2018. The country will be in good shape. If that bill does not get through, it's a watered down tea instead of bourbon, then he's going to be in trouble.
To this point, you ran for president twice as a businessman. Has Donald Trump's reputation and what he's done so far hurt or helped the prospect that a businessman or businesswoman might be elected in the future as president of the United States?
I think American voters now have demonstrated they'll look at anyone, regardless of background. And if you make the case, fine. If you don't, you're going to be on the sidelines. I know a lot of Democrats, CEOs like Bob Iger at Disney and Schultz, former CEO of Starbucks, are all looking at the thing. I think they're going to find, as they look at it more closely, they're going to find it's going to be a lot harder than they think. It's a tendency. If you know somebody and you say, well, if he can do it, why can't I do it? And then they find out, well, there's a reason why you couldn't do it.
Well, you're 70 now. Any thoughts of running again?
I'm an agitator now.
You're an agitator.
I'm agitating on things.
You're Steve Bannon? Is that who you are?
No, I'm Steve Forbes. Last I looked, no 60-minute interviews in my
Yeah,
future.
I saw that the other day.
But pushing things like simplified tax code and health care reform and the like.
All right. Well, I want to talk about that in just a second. But it's in fairness to President Trump, he's had some things to say about Congress, the Republican Congress. What are your views on the Republican Congress?
I have to be a little careful because I'm in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, but I think the GOP in Congress has made a couple of big mistakes. One was leading off with health care because of this crazy thing they felt they had to satisfy the Congressional Budget Office. And so for arcane reasons that no one understands and should understand, they led off with health care, which is a much more difficult topic than it would have been a good tax initiative. So they should have led with taxes. Heck with projections 10 years down the road. Get the right bill, get it through, and they'd have had the political capital to tackle more difficult things like health care.
We're talking with Steve Forbes, who's the chairman and CEO of Forbes Media, and he's visiting the University of Louisville, the Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise, and the School of Business, College of Business at UofL. Well, let's talk about tax reform. You were a big flat tax advocate when you ran for president twice. That's what everybody knows Steve Forbes as. He's the big flat tax guy. Are you still the big flat tax guy?
Yes, and getting bigger, but yes.
And older too, right?
Yeah, sadly. But better than the alternative.
That is true.
So yes, very much in favor of the flat tax. 40 countries and jurisdictions around the world have put it in the last 20 years, and it's worked fairly well. And so what it would do is just throw out this horrific, corrupt tax code. You could literally do your tax return on a single sheet of paper or on a few keystrokes on your computer and be done with it. You just have generous exemptions for kids and for adults, and that's it. Say a family of four, and the plan I had, a family of four, the first $52,800 of income would be free of federal income tax. And then only 17 cents on the dollar above that. No tax on savings, no tax on, when you die. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. No more inheritance, death taxes. So it was pretty straightforward. Sadly, we're not going to get it this time.
That's what I was going to say. The political reality is that's not going to happen.
Well, it's political reality because people aren't pushing it. And I was disappointed in the last campaign. None of the candidates really pushed it. Two of them had it on their platform, Senator Paul from this state and Ted Cruz from Texas, but they didn't really lead with it. They didn't make it a prime issue.
So the reality is that the Republicans, as they do tax reform, will probably wind up cutting some taxes. I think that's what they're aiming to do if they can get this through. The question is, what taxes do you cut, who do you cut, and who bears the brunt if you try to do anything that's anywhere close to tax neutral? Donald Trump talked on the campaign trail at times about raising taxes on the rich to give a tax break to the middle class and the poor. Yes or no?
Do what John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan did. Do it across the board. You want to create capital, you want to have capital invested, and you want to have people keep more of what they earn, the prospect of earning more. So on the tax side, on the business side, I think even a lot of Democrats secretly know we've got to do something here. We've got the worst business tax in the world. Make it the best. Cut it to 15%. And on the individual side, double the exemption. So a family making $40,000, $50,000 a year would get an extra $1,500 right off the bat. Cut rates and do a few other tweaks, you do that, and you'll see this economy really roar ahead for the first time in a decade.
Isn't the economy roaring ahead right now? The S&P 500's up about 9%.
Don't confuse the stock
I
market with the
understand.
economy.
The gross national product is doing well, though.
Well, by the standards of the last 10 years, it's like a baseball player getting his average up to 260. Oh boy, that's so good. It's better than 200. Yeah, but he should be hitting 320.
But isn't there a risk, as your opponents would say to this plan, that you're going to have to cut something out of the federal government, which is politically tough to do, number one, and number two, that the economy, at least in the minds of a lot of Americans, is going okay right now. Don't mess with what's working. So what would you say to those two things? What would you cut, and how's the economy going?
Well, the economy is doing okay, but it's capable of doing much better. You know, if we'd had the average historic growth rates in the last 10 years the American economy has achieved, 3.5%, we wouldn't have a budget deficit today.
Okay.
There's a lot of huge lost opportunity. And I think in terms of what do you cut taxes. You begin with cutting taxes.
But you got to.
No, you don't.
You would.
Why?
Why do you think that then there would be no government programs that you'd have to cut if you cut the federal
I've got
taxes?
a whole list I'd love to cut.
Well, then if you're Donald Trump's shoes.
But in terms of getting something through now, get the taxes cut. When you have a prosperous economy, it's much easier, as Reagan showed, to make changes in programs than when people fear I might lose something. So get the economy growing. Economic growth creates revenue. Trying to cut your way to prosperity has never worked. It won't work politically. It won't work economically. So let's get the economy moving. Kennedy did it. Back in the 20s, they did it. Ronald Reagan did it. So it's not as if we're inventing something. Do it. And they say, oh, well, we can't afford it. We can't afford not to do it. Come on, people. We used to lead the world on this stuff.
Why, in your opinion, and again, you're in the media, so you cover this stuff, you know finances and the economy, why has the perception at least been that the economy has been best during the last two Democratic presidents instead of the last two Republican presidents?
Well, in terms of...
or do they not make it doesn't make a difference who the president was, it just so happens we rolled through a bad economic time?
Well, the 80s and 90s was living off of Ronald Reagan. And those were boom decades. We had a mild recession in 1992. But those were boom years, 20 years. That was the result of Ronald Reagan. We got a little bit of a boost with Bush. And then he, unfortunately, his Treasury Department went for this policy of trashing the U.S. dollar and not doing big tax cuts. President Obama had no interest in tax cuts, which is why the growth rates in the last 10 years, the last 2 years of Bush and 8 years of Barack Obama, were the worst since the 1930s. The average growth rate wasn't much above what we had in the 30s. 30s was a huge roller coaster. But after 08 and 09, we should have had, at least initially, a big burst back. And then the question is, could you sustain it? But we never had it.
We're talking with Steve Forbes, who's the chairman and CEO of Forbes Media, who's on the campus of the University of Louisville, speaking to students. And you just got done talking to some students. What were some of the things you heard from the students today, the questions that they asked, that interested you or perhaps threw you for a loop and you hadn't really thought about? Was there anything?
Well, I think what they reflected there, not to speak for them individually, but as a group, they feel the jury's out on Donald Trump. They hope he succeeds, but they've realized that it's
like the rest of America.
It's more uphill than it should have been, and they're taking a wait-and-see attitude. They're conservative. They have beliefs in free people, free markets, and so they're hoping that those kinds of principles will translate into policy. And they also don't make the mistake that thinking that Donald Trump is a traditional Republican. They know that's not the case.
He's a populist.
As Senator McConnell will testify.
Firsthand, I think he knows that one. When you're speaking to folks about what else is going on in this country, and they ask you about DACA, illegal immigration, those kinds of things, from a business perspective, what should, in your view, the United States policy be on DACA and on immigration, the wall with Mexico, those kinds of things?
Well, on DACA, I think Congress is going to do it. Nobody disputes that you shouldn't punish somebody who was brought in here as an infant or a kid. The problem is how Barack Obama did it. I think he did it very cynically. He didn't try to get it through Congress. He did it by executive order, which the courts take a dim view of. We're not Louis XIV absolute monarchy in this country. So you got to get it through Congress. So it's in Congress's hands. They've got at least 6 months to get the job done. So it's not what ought to be done. It's now getting it done in a legal constitutional way. And immigration as a whole, I do think that we do need work programs in areas like construction, especially now for rebuilding in Texas and Florida. We have a shortage of construction workers in this country, even before those two disasters. So we're going to have to look at, and Bush did this after Katrina, President Bush. So if you have needs of outside workers, bring them in, know who they are, and they're here for a specific period of time. You need it in agriculture, you need it in other areas, you need it in high tech. So let's do it in a sane way instead of averting our eyes.
So a harsh crackdown on all illegals or folks that's a bad idea for business, is I think what you're trying to say.
No, well, the thing is, you've allowed 11 million people.
They're already here.
They're already here. And so they're not going to be shipped in boxcars out of the country. So the question is, where do we go forward? We do have needs in this economy. Recognize the needs and deal with them legally. On DACA, do it legally instead of trying to create a wedge issue. Look, Barack Obama 10 years ago blocked efforts by people like Ted Kennedy and George W. Bush were trying to craft a bipartisan immigration bill back in 2007 that would combine better border patrol, programs that we've talked about, try to deal with this thing, deal with what we now call DACA. And Barack Obama was one of the ones who led the charge to try to undo it with what they call in the Senate killer amendments. So his record on this, I think, is pretty poor. This could have been solved 10 years ago.
But now we're looking at Donald Trump, and I think it'll be interesting to see what he does. How about that? Is that fair to?
Well, I think on
he
DACA,
said one thing, but I don't know that.
No, if Congress, which I think they will, especially by the turn of the year, will pass DACA, he will sign it.
All right, you're my stockbroker right now. What should I invest in?
First, give me your money, and then I'll. Well, there's my grandfather who
over the short term, next year or so. What's going to happen with the economy? What should I invest in?
Well, my grandfather, we were celebrating now our 100th anniversary of Forbes, and he was an immigrant to this country, one of 10 children, grade school education, very little money. One of the things he liked to say was that you make more money selling the advice than following it. So beware.
So you're not going to give me any advice, or I've got to ask the question.
Oh, I've got a subscription card here for Forbes that will give you the advice you need. But in terms of the market, you should at least, one, recognize emotions are your enemy, and two, recognize or try to leave your retirement plan out of trying to hit grand slam home runs. Do a few index funds with low fees.
I've got mostly index funds right now.
Put the money in there
so
quarterly, monthly, and just ignore it until you're ready to retire. And do the picking and that kind of thing with your non-retirement money. If you index your retirement money, you'll do just fine.
Do you see the economy slowing down? It appears there's some signs that it's slowing down. Do you see something happening perhaps over the winter months or not?
Well, the economy, this is what's so frustrating. The last 10 years, it shows signs of picking up, then goes down, picking up, then goes down, but always never really getting out of second gear. This is where you need a good tax bill to get it in third or fourth gear. So you get 4% growth instead of saying, oh, we got up to 3. Nice. That should be the average, not the height of a 10-year expansion, for crying out loud.
We'll see if that happens. Well, Steve Forbes, again, we appreciate you being on the University of Louisville campus. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cars.